Good morning. I want to draw your attention to these invitations that you'll find in the pew where you're seated. There's 3 in each pew. We encourage you to hand this to somebody this week and invite them to be with you on March 27th for our morning of hope and renewal. Those of you who are part of our online family will be emailing some digital versions of this that you can forward in emails. We'll also be posting this on our social media sites and encourage you to share those posts with others. We would like to invite our friends, family, neighbors, coworkers, and others to be with us on March 27th. So take these this morning. Don't leave any in the pews. Take them and hand them out to friends and others this week. I was really grateful to spend some time over the last week at a retreat of church leaders who are exploring how to minister more to the LGBTQ plus community. It was in rural Texas, and we ate out at a couple of restaurants in a small rural Texas town while I was there. Most of us had never been to these restaurants before. They had a pretty good, extensive selection of offerings for small town restaurants. And so when we went in, we just asked the waiter, well, what are you known for? That is, of all the dishes that you can make, what do most people order when they come here? What are you most known for? And the waiter told us, and several of us ordered those very things. I suppose if we were to ask Jesus, what are you known for? He would point to this sermon in Luke chapter 6. Of all the sermons that Jesus prepared, of all the dishes that he served up for listeners, this was one of his favorite sermons. And we know this because Jesus preached this sermon on more than one occasion. This sermon in Luke chapter 6 shows up again in Matthew 5 through 7 in a different point in the timeline. There Jesus is preaching it from a mountain, and so it's called the Sermon on the Mount. And here in Luke chapter 6, it's preached from a level place or a plain, and we call it the Sermon on the Plain. Let's just stop for a moment and notice some of the similarities and differences between what we read in Luke chapter 6 and what we read in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. So Luke's version is very short, 30 verses, versus Matthew's version, 107 verses. Both of us give the setting. Matthew tells us it's on a mountain. Luke tells us it's on the plain. Both of them include what we call beatitudes, statements of blessing, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. And then each of them have their own material that follows those beatitudes. Both of them talk about the importance of loving enemies, and we're going to talk about that this morning. Matthew follows that with a large amount of material on prayer, fasting, giving, and worry. Both of them have a section on judging, and we'll draw attention to that this morning. Matthew follows that with additional teaching from Jesus on asking, seeking, knocking, and statements about what it means to know and to be known by Jesus. And then both of them end this sermon with statements about trees and fruit and houses built on sand or houses built on rock. We'll be in Luke chapter 6 this morning. I encourage you to read the other version in Matthew 5 through 7 on your own and just continue to notice some of those similarities and differences. We're going to take all of Luke chapter 6, this whole Sermon on the Plain, in this morning. We're not going to spend long in any of the sections, but get a sense of the whole sermon itself and really the 3 main ideas that are in the sermon. So in the first part of the sermon, Jesus invites us to live from a blessing rather than for a blessing. Gary Smalley and John Trent once wrote a book called The Blessing, and it was a book about the way in which most of us spend our lives seeking a blessing from our parents. And if we receive that blessing, their approval, their acceptance, then we go on to thrive. We go on to live very successful lives. But if we don't get that blessing from our parents, their approval, their acceptance, then we really spend the rest of our lives trying to live for that blessing. And we can end up doing that in some very unhealthy ways. So they go back and look in the ancient world, the ancient Jewish world, at the idea of blessing and the way that parents would bless their children. And they say these blessings had these 5 qualities to them. There was often meaningful touch involved, a hug or a hand on a child's head or a shoulder. There was often a spoken message that was given where the children would hear the blessing from their parents. There was often a sense of attaching high value to the child, using words that affirm that child's intrinsic worth, their unique individual traits. There was a picturing of a special future for that child, affirming that there are good things that are going to be coming in the life of that child. And then finally, an active commitment on the parents' part to be there, to help and support that child in the future. This was the blessing that the Jewish parents would pass on to their children. And this is, in a way, a blessing that our own parents can pass on to us. And those of us who receive these kinds of blessings from our parents, especially early on, go on to live and to thrive. And those of us who don't receive these things, we look for those things, these blessings, often in lots of unhealthy ways. And so it's very interesting that Jesus begins this sermon by talking about blessing and the importance of blessing in walking with Christ. So let's listen as Bess reads this text for us.
And he lifted his eyes up on his disciples, and he said, Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you shall be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, and revile you, and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day, and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven. For so their fathers did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all people speak well of you, for so their fathers did to false prophets.
Thank you, Bess. So one of the things that Jesus is doing in this initial section is drawing attention to 2 different groups of people. And in the ancient worldview, these would be 2 different groups of people, one of whom has the blessing of God and the other of whom does not have the blessing of God. In Jesus' time, only certain people received the blessing. And who was that? Well, it was the wealthy. It was the rich. It was those who had an abundance of things, those who were well thought of, who were popular, who were commonly known in their cities and villages. Those are the ones who received the blessing from God. Everyone else, the poor, those who wept because they had little, those who hungered, they did not have the blessing from God. Now they might strive to live for that blessing, to get that blessing from God, but it was not already theirs. And what Jesus is doing at the beginning of the sermon is saying, no, that is not how God works. There are not some who already have the blessing and some who are going to have to live the rest of their lives seeking that blessing. Jesus begins the sermon by announcing blessing on his listeners. They already have the blessing of God. And they can now live out of that blessing rather than living for that blessing. And there is a world of difference between these 2 ways of understanding blessing. When we are living for a blessing from God that we don't currently have, that leads to frustration. We're constantly frustrated because we don't yet have this blessing from God. When we're living from a blessing, it leads to all kinds of good fruit because it's something that we already do have. Living for a blessing is living each day with feelings of insecurity, wondering if we're going to get from God what we need from God. Living from a blessing leads to feelings of security and confidence in life. Living for a blessing leads to that sense that someday I'll be enough because someday I'll have a blessing from God, whereas living from a blessing leads to that sense that today I'm already enough because I already have the blessing and love of God. And living for a blessing means that anytime I fail, it's going to jeopardize that future blessing that might come from God. Whereas when I'm living from a posture of blessing, when I fail, it doesn't jeopardize that blessing at all because I already possess that blessing. And so what Jesus is doing in one of his most famous, his favorite sermons, is affirming that you, right now, in this moment, you are blessed by God. And you can live out of that blessing. And that's important because in the rest of the sermon, Jesus is going to call us to live out some extremely different and difficult lifestyles. But we live out those lifestyles not to get some blessing in the future from God, but because we've already been blessed by God. Now that leads to the second part, the middle part of the Sermon on the Plain. And in this middle part, Jesus explores how we respond to two types of wrongdoers. Those people who, in general, do wrong, and those people who specifically do wrong to us. Now, in our broader culture, there are often some pretty common ways of responding to wrongdoers, and some of this sort of depends on where you are in the political spectrum. But especially these days, if someone is deemed to be an intellectual wrongdoer, they're banned. Their books are banned. Their works are banned. We try to remove those things from easy access to people. If someone is deemed to be morally wrong these days, they're canceled. We try to remove their platform. We try to remove their influence in the world around us. Of course, revenge continues to be a very common response to wrongdoing, i.e. the latest Batman movie. If someone does wrong to you, you do wrong to them. We seek out vengeance. What Jesus says in this middle part of the sermon is that the central test of whether or not we are a disciple of Jesus is the degree to which humility and mercy characterize the way that we treat wrongdoers. So let's stop right here and let's just listen as Penelope reads this text to us.
But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also, and from one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, get back the same amount. But love your enemies and do good, and lend expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great. And you will be a son of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful even as your Father is merciful. Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with it measure you use will be measured back to you. He also told them a parable. Can a blind man not lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do you not notice that log that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, Brother, let me take out the speck that is in your eye, when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck that is in your brother's eye.
Thank you, Penelope. So Jesus is saying a lot of things in this middle part of the sermon, but it really boils down to this, that the central test of whether or not we are disciples is the degree to which humility and mercy characterize the way we treat wrongdoers. So Jesus asks, what do you do with the wrongdoing of hostility? When someone is hostile to you, Jesus says, you bless them, you pray for them, you do good to them, and in this way you become children of the Most High. That is, in that way, you respond to wrongdoing the way that God, your Father, responds to wrongdoing. And then Jesus asks, what do you do with the wrongdoing of immorality? Well, Jesus says you don't judge, you don't spotlight that person's sin and magnify it for others. Instead, you forgive, and you use that as an opportunity for self-reflection on your own sin. Now, I understand that this teaching raises all kinds of hard questions. Shouldn't a wrongdoer pay the consequences for their sin? Isn't it okay for us to call out sin when we see it in the lives of others or our community? Doesn't this teaching just give people license to live any way that they want to live? It's okay to ask those questions. But at the end of the day, in this favorite sermon of Jesus, Jesus says the test of whether or not we are his disciples is the degree to which mercy and humility characterize our response to wrongdoing. I was really struck by something that Wendell Gunn shared during one of our 4 Sundays devoted to Black History Month. Wendell's a member here. He was the first black student admitted to the University of North Alabama, and that only after suing the school to gain entrance. Wendell shared that when that process started, so did all the phone calls, death threats in the form of phone calls. People calling Wendell, telling him they wanted to kill him because he wanted to go to school there. I was really struck by how Wendell decided to handle that wrongdoing. He made a decision. It was a simple yet significant decision. And the decision he made was this: he would not be the one to hang up on any of those phone calls. As difficult as they were, as wrong as they were, he would demonstrate humility and mercy by never being the person to hang up in those difficult phone calls. I can't imagine how difficult that was, but what a marvelous reflection of the teaching of Jesus. And of course, this middle part is tied to the first part, because the more we live from a posture of blessing, understanding how free and generous God's already been with us, the easier it is for us to be free and generous with others, no matter who they are. And that leads then to the last part of the Sermon on the Mount. And in this last part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is dealing with the issue of how. How in the world do you grow to become a kind of person who can love like that, who can love even the most unlovable person around? Now, our culture's answer to growth, to maturity, to change is often outside in. You want to become a better person? Get some new clothes. You want to become a better person? Get a new car, get a new career, get a new house, move to a new city. Our culture is largely oriented around change and transformation from the outside in. One of my good friends in high school was named Kevin. And Kevin was the coolest guy I knew. He had cool hair. He looked a little bit like David Hasselhoff from Baywatch and Knight Rider fame. You can Google him. He had a cool leather jacket that he would wear to school. He had those cool gloves, without fingers to them. He would listen to the coolest music. He was the quarterback on our football team during his senior year, the coolest position that you could play in football. The one thing he lacked to truly be cool was a cool car. I remember the day that his dad bought him a car. Kevin could afford one, so his dad, who lived in another state, said that he would buy Kevin a car. And I remember the day that Kevin drove that car to school. I anticipated seeing a bright red Mustang or some kind of loud muscle car pulling up to the school. When Kevin pulled up that morning, it was an old Ford Pinto. There was not a less cool car in the 1980s than an old Ford Pinto. It was the only car that his dad could afford. And we teased Kevin mercilessly because he drove an old Ford Pinto. And what strikes me about all of that is the way that we had all bought into this sort of outside-in idea that if you could just change enough externals and finally change the car, then that would mean something significant about the identity of Kevin and of us as friends of the cool guy. But what Jesus does in the last part of the sermon is point to an entirely different way of thinking about growth. So let's stop here and listen as Kate reads this last section.
For no good trees bear bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. The good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. Why do you call me, Lord, Lord, and do not what I tell you? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words does them. I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when a flood arose, the stream broke against the house and could not shake it, because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not do to them is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the streams broke against it, it immediately fell, and the ruin of the house was great.
Thank you, Kate. Again, there's a lot being said in this last part of the sermon on the plain, but one of them is that Jesus is saying that growing into the kind of person that he's just described in the middle of the sermon, who loves even the most unlovable, requires growing from the inside out and the bottom up. So Jesus uses images from two spheres of life. One is the sphere of farming, and the other is the sphere of construction. Farmers know, Jesus says. Farmers know that you can't change the fruit without changing the root. Thorn bushes are not going to produce figs. Bramble bushes are not going to produce grapes. If you want to change the fruit on the outside, you have to change the root on the inside. And in the same way, people who do construction know that if you want a stable, livable house, it all starts with the foundation. If the foundation is built on something flimsy, the house is going to fall, no matter how well built the rest of the house is. Jesus is using both of these images to say, if you want to be the kind of person that I've just talked about in the middle of this sermon, it's going to take growth from the inside out and from the bottom up. Now, both of these point to things that tend to be less seen or nearly invisible. Most of us don't see the foundation of the building that we're sitting in right now. It's under the ground. And most of us don't see the roots of the plants, the trees, that are around us. They're buried under the ground. And yet it's those unseen things that have the greatest impact on what is seen. And so this then points us to what people have called the spiritual disciplines. It's often the unseen practices that we do when we're alone, outside of the public eye, like confession and prayer and meditation and silence and solitude and contemplation of Scripture. It's often those unseen practices that have the greatest impact on what others see. They prompt growth from the inside out and from the bottom up. And this is especially important in the season that we're in right now, the season of Lent that began this last Wednesday. During this time of self-reflection, as we consider the life and death of Jesus and our own lives and deaths, it's important to remember that there's not a pill that we can take. There's not a surgery that we can have. There's not a possession that we can acquire that will significantly change who we are. To become more like Christ requires growth from the inside out and from the bottom up. As we close this morning, I want to invite you to just meditate on these three questions related to the three parts of this favorite sermon from Jesus. What could it feel like for me to live each day from God's blessing rather than for God's blessing? What forms of mercy and humility is God inviting me into as I consider my response to wrongdoers? And what might be required for me to grow from the inside out and from the bottom up? Just take a moment in silence to consider those questions.